Hello, everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch the child kept pointing at the trash can and crying, and the mother was horrified when she discovered Julia took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on her little daughter, Nora, who beamed with rosy cheeks. At just over 2 years old, Nora still carried the innocent look of an angel, her giggles filling their small house with joy. "Are you hungry, my love?" Julia asked gently, bending down as Nora reached for a cookie. Nora nodded but seemed distracted, her gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the rusted trash bin in front of the old neighbor's house stood silently. The neighbors had moved away, leaving the time-worn bin behind. Nora pointed at the bin, her face showing a hint of fear. "Nora, what's out there?" Julia asked, smiling, but Nora didn't respond. Instead, she clung to her mother, her wide eyes filled with a strange terror. Julia dismissed it as childish curiosity, comforting Nora with soft words. But over the following days, Nora's behavior changed. Every time they passed the bin, she shrank back, pale and frightened. Julia grew puzzled and concerned, but reassured herself that children often imagine things. One evening, as Julia prepared dinner, Nora stood by the window, staring at the trash bin again. Julia approached softly. "Nora, what do you see there?" she asked. In a weak, almost inaudible voice, Nora whispered, "The person in the darkness." Julia's heart skipped a beat. She turned to the window, but nothing unusual appeared, just a shadowy outline of the bin and the nearby trees. From that day, Julia felt an unease whenever she passed the bin. Though she told herself it was likely Nora's imagination, the fear in her daughter's eyes lingered in her thoughts. "There's nothing to be afraid of, my love," Julia reassured her daughter, but the words did little to soothe either of them. Nora clung to Julia, burying her face in her chest whenever they neared the bin. Nora was usually curious and adventurous, so her fear was out of character. One night, Julia dreamed of walking through darkness, surrounded by eerie whispers. In her dream, the trash bin loomed before her, an oppressive sense of dread emanating from it. When she woke, sweat covered her forehead. Julia glanced at Nora, sleeping peacefully beside her, but the unease lingered. The next day, during their stroll, Nora refused to leave the house. "Mommy, no," she cried when they passed the bin, her face pale and tense. Julia grew increasingly concerned. A foul odor emanated from the bin one afternoon, and when she approached to investigate, she noticed faint bloodstains on its lid. Her heart raced, but she tried to rationalize it. "Maybe someone threw something sharp in here," she murmured, pulling Nora away. That night, Julia awoke again, haunted by dreams of suffocating darkness and cold air seeping from the bin. The next day, Julia encountered an elderly woman near the park. The woman, draped in a worn coat, glanced at the trash bin and spoke in a raspy voice. "It's still there, isn't it?" Julia, startled, asked what she meant. The woman's words were cryptic. "Sometimes, what's inside isn't what it seems. Don't get too close. Some things are best left alone." Julia felt a chill as the woman walked away, leaving her with more questions than answers. That evening, Julia heard strange scratching noises near the bin. Nora clung to her, whispering, "Mommy, it's there again." Julia realized she couldn't ignore the situation any longer. She confided in her husband, Peter, who listened patiently. "The trash bin? What's so special about it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Julia explained Nora's fears and the unsettling occurrences, her voice trembling with worry. As she spoke, Julia felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. Something about that old, rusted trash bin was far from ordinary, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her family was being watched by the very darkness Nora feared. Peter laughed, but his smile faded when he saw the seriousness in Julia's expression. "Are you really that worried about a trash bin?" he asked. Julia sighed, her voice tinged with unease. "I know it sounds strange, but lately I've seen some bloodstains around it, and that terrible smell." She hesitated before continuing. "Today, I met an old woman who said something strange about the bin. It's like there's something frightening inside it." Peter was silent, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But he quickly composed himself. "I think you might just be tired," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's probably just stray cats leaving those marks." Julia nodded, attempting to trust her husband's words, but a gnawing sense of unease remained. The next morning, as Julia took her daughter Nora out, she noticed fresh scratch marks on the trash bin's lid, as though something inside had tried to escape. This time, Julia couldn't dismiss it. Nora clutched her mother's hand, her voice trembling. "Mommy, don't go near it," she whispered, her wide eyes filled with fear. Julia's heart raced, but she tried to reassure herself that it was all in their imaginations. Despite her efforts to dismiss the fear, the image of the trash bin and the strange signs around it lingered in her mind all day. That night, Julia found it impossible to sleep. As she lay in bed, she felt as though someone or something was watching her from the direction of the bin. Looking out the window, she noticed an eerie stillness around it. The next day, she observed something unusual. No birds flew over the area near the bin, and the usual morning chirps were absent. It was as if the bin repelled life itself. Peter noticed her distant behavior and tried to comfort her. "You need rest," he said gently. "Everything will be fine." But Julia couldn't shake her unease. Later that morning, Julia decided to ask the neighbors if they had noticed anything strange. At a nearby park, she broached the topic cautiously. "Has anyone seen anything odd around the trash bin by the old neighbor's house?" she asked. An older man frowned. "I've heard that some cats have gone missing recently. Maybe they got into the bin and got stuck." Julia felt a chill at his words. Missing cats? The ominous idea gnawed at her, and back home, she decided she needed to investigate. That night, Julia ventured outside alone. The street was quiet, the air cold. As she approached the bin, she heard faint scratching sounds, as if something inside was trying to escape. Fear gripped her, but she forced herself to stay calm, convincing herself it was just the wind. Yet the bone-chilling fear stayed with her, and she couldn't dismiss the growing sense that something was very wrong. The next day, Julia visited Carmen, an elderly neighbor who had lived in the area for years. When Julia asked about the bin, Carmen hesitated before replying, "I think you shouldn't go near it. That bin has stories tied to it." Julia pressed for details, and Carmen reluctantly shared a homeless man used to live around here. He disappeared mysteriously, and since then, people say they've heard strange noises from that bin. Julia shuddered. Could there truly be something sinister about the trash bin? Nora's fear only deepened. Each time they passed the bin, she would cry and beg her mother not to go near it. One morning, Julia found her daughter staring out the window, tears streaming down her face. "There's someone in there, Mommy. A bad person," Nora whispered. Julia's heart sank as a cold dread washed over her. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. One night, Julia heard the scratching again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Gathering her courage, she peered out the window. The bin stood still under the flickering streetlight, but the noises persisted. Unable to rest, Julia stepped outside. The cold air seemed to cling to her as she approached the bin. The sounds grew louder, more distinct, and an overpowering sense of dread made her step back. The next morning, Julia decided to take action. She called the police, reporting the strange sounds and unsettling signs around the trash bin. However, the dispatcher dismissed her concerns, suggesting there was nothing to worry about. Julia hung up, feeling more alone than ever. The mystery of the trash bin had consumed her, and she knew she had to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Julia felt both vindicated and sorrowful as she watched the police take Mrs. Josephine's statement. The elderly woman had endured so much at the hands of her own son, Adrian, a betrayal that was both heartbreaking and enraging. As Mrs. Josephine recounted her story, her voice trembled with a mix of pain and resolve, and Julia sat beside her, offering a steady presence of comfort and reassurance. Adrian's greed had turned him into someone unrecognizable, and the depth of his cruelty left everyone in the room speechless. The officer assured Mrs. Josephine that her case would be taken seriously and that justice would be pursued. Julia and Peter promised to remain by her side throughout the process, their determination to help her only growing stronger. Over the next few weeks, Julia worked tirelessly to ensure Mrs. Josephine's safety. She and Peter helped her move into a safe and supportive environment, far from Adrian's reach. As Mrs. Josephine slowly recovered her health and strength, she began to smile more, her spirit reigniting with each passing day. The warmth and gratitude in her eyes were a testament to the power of kindness and solidarity. Julia couldn't help but reflect on how this journey had begun, with an eerie trash bin that had filled her and Nora with dread. What had initially seemed like a mysterious and sinister presence had turned out to be the harrowing story of a forgotten soul. Julia marveled at the resilience of the human spirit, both in Mrs. Josephine's fight for survival and in her own resolve to uncover the truth. One sunny morning, as Julia and Nora walked past the now empty trash bin, Nora stopped and looked up at her mother. "Mommy, is the bad person gone now?" she asked softly. Julia knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly. "Yes, my love. The bad person is gone, and Mrs. Josephine is safe now. We helped her, and she's going to be okay." Nora smiled, her fear replaced with a sense of comfort and security. For Julia, the journey had not only been about protecting her family, but also about standing up against cruelty and neglect. Mrs. Josephine's story served as a powerful reminder of the importance of compassion and the strength that comes from reaching out to others in need. As the weeks turned into months, Julia stayed in close contact with Mrs. Josephine, visiting her often and helping her adjust to her new life. With Julia and Peter's support, Mrs. Josephine began to rebuild her life, surrounded by kindness and care. And though the shadows of her past still lingered, they no longer defined her future. "Adrian, this is abuse and neglect, and we will protect your rights," Julia said, holding the elderly woman's hand to reassure her as she became emotional. "Everything will be okay, Mrs. Josephine. We'll be here for you." After the police left, Mrs. Josephine turned to Julia and Peter, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you both. I don't know what I would have done without you. This is the first time in years I feel like I'm not alone." Peter held her hand warmly and said, "Mrs. Josephine, from now on, we're your family. You don't have to endure anything else, and your son will have to pay for what he's done." Mrs. Josephine smiled, tears flowing from emotion. "Family? Do I really have a family now?" Julia nodded gently, patting her shoulder. "Yes, Mrs. Josephine. You have me, Peter, and even Nora. We all care about you." From that moment on, Julia and Peter were determined to take care of Mrs. Josephine, ensuring she wouldn't face anything alone. They arranged for her to move in with them after being discharged, and their home became a place of comfort and peace for her, something she had longed for. A few days later, Julia brought Mrs. Josephine home. As they entered, Nora ran over, her eyes filled with joy. She looked at Mrs. Josephine with curiosity, but an open friendliness, as if sensing she was special. "Mom, who's that lady?" Nora asked, her voice sweet and curious. Julia knelt down and gently spoke to her daughter. "This is Mrs. Josephine, the lady I told you about. She'll be staying with us from now on." Nora smiled, reaching out to hold Mrs. Josephine's hand. "Hello, Mrs. Josephine. I'm Nora." Mrs. Josephine looked at Nora, her eyes brimming with emotion and affection. "Hello, Nora. I'm very happy to be here with your family." Julia and Peter exchanged glances, feeling joy at seeing Mrs. Josephine gradually finding happiness again. In the days that followed, Julia and Peter assisted Mrs. Josephine in resolving her legal issues with Adrian to ensure she would receive justice. Above all, they gave her a new home where she was loved and cared for. Mrs. Josephine's life began to stabilize, and a smile slowly returned to her face. Julia and Peter spent time taking care of her, while Nora became close to her, often staying by her side like a real granddaughter. One morning, as Julia and Mrs. Josephine sat outside enjoying the sunlight, Julia smiled and asked, "Mrs. Josephine, do you feel comfortable here?" Mrs. Josephine nodded, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "I truly feel at peace." "Thank you, Julia." Because of you, I no longer have to live in fear. Despite this peace, the legal issue with Adrian was still ongoing. One day, Julia received a call from the officer handling the case. She sat beside Mrs. Josephine and handed her the phone so she could hear the news firsthand. "Hello, Mrs. Josephine," the officer said. "We have good news for you. After a thorough investigation and gathering sufficient evidence, we've issued an arrest warrant for Adrian on charges of abuse and abandonment of an elderly person." Mrs. Josephine sat silently, her eyes reflecting both surprise and relief. Julia gently held her hand, feeling a surge of joy. "We'll do everything we can to ensure Adrian faces the law. You don't have to worry anymore," the officer added. When the call ended, Mrs. Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd see the day I'd receive justice like this. I once thought I would have to stay silent and endure, but now it's different." Julia smiled and patted her shoulder. "You deserve this, Mrs. Josephine. From now on, you'll never have to live in fear again." Peter joined them, placing a hand on Mrs. Josephine's shoulder. "Not only do you have justice, but you have a family too. We'll always be here to protect you." Mrs. Josephine looked at Julia, Peter, and little Nora playing nearby, her heart filled with emotion. "You're my family. I don't know what to say other than thank you." Suddenly, Nora ran over, holding Mrs. Josephine's hand. "Mrs. Josephine, are you happy?" "I'm so happy you're here," she said. Mrs. Josephine nodded, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I'm very happy, Nora. Thank you for bringing back the happiness I thought I'd lost long ago." In the days that followed, Julia's family showered Mrs. Josephine with love and care. They shared meals, told stories, and filled their home with laughter. Julia and Peter worked tirelessly to help Mrs. Josephine regain trust in life and feel truly part of their family. One evening, as Julia and Mrs. Josephine sat together, the elderly woman hesitantly said, "Julia, I know I've been a burden on you and your family, but I'm so grateful for all you've done." Julia took her hand, her gaze filled with empathy. "Mrs. Josephine, you're not a burden. Family is for loving and supporting one another. We're happy to have you in our lives." Mrs. Josephine smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Thank you, Julia. I never thought I'd be this blessed." Julia replied warmly, "From now on, live for your own happiness. We'll create beautiful memories together." Mrs. Josephine was no longer a lonely, mistreated elderly woman. Now, she was part of a loving family where she was cherished. Peter joined them, saying, "From now on, please consider this house your home. We'll all live happily together." Nora came running over, laughing. "I really like Mrs. Josephine. Will she stay here forever, Mom?" Julia and Peter smiled and nodded. Julia replied, "Yes, Nora. Mrs. Josephine will stay with us, and we'll all live together in happiness." Mrs. Josephine took Nora's hand, her eyes shining. For the first time in years, she felt peace and completeness. This story of Mrs. Josephine is a profound reminder of compassion, patience, and the responsibility to protect one another. Through Julia's determination, a heartbreaking story of neglect was brought to light. Julia's choice to act on her compassion instead of fear ensured Mrs. Josephine found not only justice, but also a loving family. It's a lesson in the power of love and humanity to transform lives.